Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about 10 Myths About Israel by Ilan Pappe. This book was published in 2017 and is one of those books that I say I wish I'd read it first, but as I've said in other instances and when I've said I wish I'd read that book first, I have so much more knowledge that I bring to the table now about these myths, and yet it also reveals the gaps in my knowledge. So it's a short little work. I want to say, yeah, just under 170 pages altogether. And the 10 myths that Pape goes through are going to give you a basic understanding of the points. In each of the myths, you're going to have to read more in order to have deeper conversations with people. But if you are in the rare situation in which you are with someone who is genuinely open-minded and doesn't simply believe whatever the mainstream media says or just repeats the Zionist talking points or the IDF talking points, the way that Pape presents these walks you through chronologically from Palestine was an empty land to the two-state solution is a quote-unquote solution. So let's get into it. The very first myth is Palestine was an empty land. Palestine was not an empty land. There were many, many people living there. And if you'd like more context for that, I would recommend One Palestine Complete by Tom Segev. If you want to go back even further, you can look at Seven Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. I'll put cards to both of those books above. So manifestly it was not. I don't know how people still manage to repeat this or believe this, but Palestine was not an empty land. There were hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living there. The Jews were a people without a land is myth number 2. This is also not true. Jews lived in many places. They owned property. The one that comes to mind immediately is Iraq because of Avi Shlaim and what he's written about his life growing up there in Iraq. They were integrated into the society. They owned property. They were business owners. So the idea that the Jews were a people without land is simply not true, not factually possible. But these are myths that get repeated enough and then people just repeat them. Thirdly, Zionism is Judaism. Now this is something that's perhaps most relevant to what we're talking about these days because the tendency has been for some time, but more recently, trying to conflate Zionism with Judaism, which means if you're an anti-Zionist, you're also anti-Semitic. We know that anti-Semitic doesn't really mean anything anymore, if it ever did. But anti-Zionist, AIPAC, other people are trying to make these equivalent. But Zionism is not Judaism. Remember, Judaism is a religion that's been around for thousands of years. It has nothing to do with the secular aims of Zionism, which is an ideology that came about in the late 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So Zionism is an ideology that uses Judaism when it wants, but it really is a secular, allegedly democratic idea, but probably more socialist, probably more along the lines of a dictatorship, ethno-state. Here, Pape talks about using how the Zionists will use Judaism. One of the most intriguing uses of the Bible in Zionism is that practiced by the socialist wing of the movement. The fusion of socialism with Zionism began in earnest after Herzl's death in 1904, as the various socialist factions became the leading parties in the world Zionist movement and on the ground in Palestine. For the socialists, as one of them said, the Bible provided the myth for our right over the land. It was in the Bible that they read stories about Hebrew farmers, shepherds, kings, and wars, which they appropriated as describing the ancient golden era of their nation's birth. Returning to the land meant coming back to become farmers, shepherds, and kings. Thus, they found themselves faced with a challenging paradox, for they wanted both to secularize Jewish life and to use the Bible as a justification for colonizing Palestine. In other words, though they did not believe in God, he had nonetheless promised them Palestine. This is a very famous quote. In fact, before I'd read this text, I'd heard it and I'd repeated it myself. So if you are operating off of the Bible's divine mandate, which remember, the Bible is a book of history in Israel, in Israeli schools, then you are also authorized to cleanse the land as the Israelites were told to do by God, by the enemies who were living at that time. So they overlay the biblical narrative of cleansing the land onto the present day. Israel's new Minister of Justice, this would have been in around 2017 when the book was written. Israel's new Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked, entertained similar ideas, so far only for Palestinians who have died in their attempts to resist Israel. Their whole family, she said, should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. Remember, the Palestinians cannot be considered a people. If you can dehumanize them, call them animals, call them snakes, then you can prepare people mentally to eradicate them with no pity, with no thought for humanity. Martin Buber, a prominent Zionist, was asked, I think by the Zionist Congress or other leaders, to engage with Gandhi, who had a lot of moral standing in the world, to perpetuate the Zionist case. Unfortunately for them, Gandhi wasn't on this train. He says, Palestine belongs to the Arabs in the same sense that England belongs to the English, or France to the French. It is wrong and inhuman to impose the Jews on the Arabs. Surely it would be a crime against humanity to reduce the proud Arabs so that Palestine can be restored to the Jews partly or wholly as their national home. Now, once again, this is just an opinion of someone who was considered to have a lot of moral stature. He doesn't necessarily have any skin in the game. But for those who are trying to claim the narrative of Israel above all, they're going to have to contradict Gandhi. And if a Zionist considers Gandhi to be a great man, they're going to have to explain what he means when he says that. Now, again, I'm not arguing for or against Gandhi. That's a different conversation for a different time when we talk about India, which we will probably do next year. But the idea of Zionism as Judaism in this chapter, where I just read all these quotes for, is something that still continues to this day and hour, and you have to be very careful about being pulled into it. And I've said this before, and people have mentioned this in the comments. Sometimes I will say the Jews when I'm referring to the Zionists. I'm not as bothered by this. People seem to be very careful. They need to say every time I say the Zionists as opposed to the Jews. The thing is, you can say you can use the two somewhat interchangeably, because if the Jews as a general population who are not Zionist are supporting Zionist aims, then they're together, they're conflated. You can't just say, oh, only the Zionists are doing it. The people who are in charge of the government in Israel, yes, they're absolutely ardent Zionists, but anyone who supports that government is allied with Zionists, even if they don't necessarily see themselves as Zionists. And so when you say something like the Jews, I'm not necessarily talking about the whole religion or every single person in the world. People just have to be clear that, and this happens, I heard it when I was in Lebanon this summer, I've heard it in Jordan, I've heard it in other places, I've heard it in Palestine, that when you're saying the Jews, you're obviously referring to the occupying force, not quote-unquote all Jews, not quote-unquote the entire religion of Judaism. It's just something like that. And so for people who are real nitpicky about that, I understand where you're coming from, but just to give you a bit more context, if you hear me sometimes conflate the two, it's not accidental. I don't see such a sharp division as you might. So, the fourth myth, Zionism is not colonialism. In fact, there was a comment on one of my videos recently that said, since the Jews are the indigenous people of the land, their returning to the land is an act of decolonization, which of course contradicts the narrative in the Bible, which, as I said, is a book of history in Israeli school curriculums, and indicates that the Jews were not the indigenous people in the land. They were ordered by God to kill the indigenous people of the land for various reasons, not for some arbitrary reason that God woke up and just decided he wanted these people killed. But they were ordered to do so. So the indigenous people of the land were not the Jews. The Jews had to kill the indigenous people of the land in order to move in there. So in order to believe that the Jews are the indigenous people of that land, you have to disbelieve the Bible, which a Jew that doesn't believe in the Bible is not a Jew. You see all these contradictions that are winding around. In a sense, like a Jew that doesn't believe in God is not a Jew either. A Jew is defined by adherence to the religion. These people who exist now as Jews, these are new, you could say, Jews that have existed probably, one could say, since the time of the Talmud, which is very early on. But the idea of an atheist Jew is a contradiction. It's like hot snow or hot ice. The idea that someone can be an atheist Jew is problematic at best. And as I say, that's probably a conversation for another time. But you cannot claim that the Jews are indigenous to the land without ignoring the Bible, which has the receipts for why the Jews are not indigenous to the land. So the fifth, and I suppose I could put up a card to the review I did on the Jewish State by Theodor Herzl. If you want to get a little bit more context about what Zionism is from one of the founding fathers of Zionism, better to hear it in his own words. And I read a lot of what I would say would be troublesome texts from that little pamphlet. So this one's probably the most laughable myth. The Palestinians voluntarily left their homeland in 1948. I mean, really? So I will just put a card up to 1948 by Benny Morris. Benny Morris is a Zionist Israeli Jew, and he has all the receipts for how the Palestinians did not voluntarily leave in 1948. And in fact, the first ethnic cleansing that happened, where a wave of about 300,000 Palestinians were expelled, happened prior to May 15th, 1948, when the Israeli state was declared by Ben-Gurion and I think 6 other people. The land that was allotted for the Jewish state by the UN partition resolution was filled with Palestinians, and the Haganah went in and cleansed them out. Now, I have to be careful because people don't seem to understand what the definition of ethnic cleansing is. Ethnic cleansing can involve killing people, but it just means cleaning an area and making it ethnically pure. You can do that by deporting a bunch of people, loading them into trucks and getting them out, and you've ethnically cleansed. You can also do it by killing them all. So always the smart remark in the comments was like, wow, there's how many millions of Palestinians? I guess the Israelis do a really bad job of ethnic cleansing. You don't even know what the definition of ethnic cleansing is, and then you're wandering into the comment section. Understand your definitions first and realize that there was ethnic cleansing that happened in the area set aside for the Jewish state prior to May 15th, 1948. So when everyone always says the Arabs started the war, the Palestinians started the war, then what was going on prior to May 15th, 1948, when Israel declared a state and then, let's say, commenced more offensive actions outside of the area set aside for the Jewish state? So even if we look at that, the Palestinians who were inside the land marked for the Jewish state, the UN didn't say they could be all expelled. And this is a crazy idea, which means ostensibly these would have been Palestinian citizens of the Israeli state, of the Jewish state, and that meant Israel expelled their own citizens, as there are Palestinian citizens of Israel to this day in the West Bank and in other places. So let's get serious about when we're talking about this. Now, this next myth, myth number 6, the June 1967 war was a war of no choice. So here is a hole in my knowledge. I am currently reading 1967 by Tom Segev. If you didn't listen to my review on Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete, I referenced it. I put a card for it earlier in the video. He is an excellent writer. I'm really enjoying this, and there's so much more about 1967. You could really see it's understanding the completion of what the Jews were trying to do in 1948, the Israeli state. And so all I can comment here is that what Pappe is talking about is the frame that the Israelis use. And when I do my review on 1967, I'll be able to comment more intelligently on this. But it was certainly not a war of no choice. It was, in fact, it was Israel's choice, and they got the go-ahead from the U.S. government to do it. Myth number 7, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, for anyone who's been watching the genocide that's been happening, not just since October the 7th, because the genocide has been happening since really 1948 and even before, let's say, up to 1917. But let's say in a more systematized form since 1948, and in a more crazy form since 2006 and the unilateral withdrawal of Israel from Gaza. So the idea that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, I mean, this is hilarious. We could watch this: a democracy bomb women and children, destroy schools, kill UN workers, kill independent aid workers, kill Americans, kill other internationals. Is this a democracy? I mean, it's not credible, but people still say that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's a bastion of democracy against this dark tide of Arab countries. But it's absolutely crazy to say such things. It would fly in the face of all the evidence that we've seen since October the 7th. For those of you who've only been paying attention since October the 7th, and I would say I was one of those people who was only paying attention shortly before October the 7th. I'd only visited Palestine and Israel earlier that year in May. So I had really started to pay attention prior to that time. As you'll often find, you can't go to Palestine and not get radicalized. This is true for IDF soldiers, and it's true for people like myself. There is further evidence that Israel was not a democracy prior to 1967. The state pursued a shoot-to-kill policy towards refugees trying to retrieve their land, crops, and husbandry, and staged a colonial war to topple Nasser's regime in Egypt. Its security forces were also trigger-happy, killing more than 50 Palestinian citizens during the period 1948 to 1967. So, I mean, we know it's not a democracy, but as I say, I want to keep reading Pappe's quotes. Today, more than 90% of the land is owned by the Jewish National Fund. I say owned in parentheses. Landowners are not allowed to engage in transactions with non-Jewish citizens, and public land is prioritized for the use of national projects, which means that new Jewish settlements are being built, while there are hardly any new Palestinian settlements. Thus, the biggest Palestinian city, Nazareth, despite the tripling of its population since 1948, has not expanded 1 square kilometer, whereas the development town built above it, Upper Nazareth, has tripled in size, on land expropriated from Palestinian landowners. The Supreme Court in Israel has only been able to question the legality of this policy in a few individual cases, but not in principle. Imagine if in the UK or the United States, Jewish citizens, or Catholics for that matter, were barred by law from living in certain villages, neighborhoods, or maybe whole towns. How can such a situation be reconciled with the notion of democracy? It is part of what the Israeli political system regards as the status quo, which is always better than any change. Israel will control most of Palestine, and since it will always include a substantial Palestinian population, this can only be done by non-democratic means. From the very beginning of the occupation, then, the Palestinians were given 2 options: accept the reality of permanent incarceration in a mega prison for a very long time. Remember, Moshe Dayan said, we have no solution. Those who want to leave will leave. You will live like dogs, and we will see what happens. Accept the reality of permanent incarceration in a mega prison for a very long time, or risk the might of the strongest army in the Middle East. When the Palestinians did resist, as they did in 1987, 2000, 2006, 2012, 2014, and 2016, they were targeted as soldiers and units of a conventional army. Thus, villages and towns were bombed as if they were military bases, and the unarmed civilian population was shot at as if it was an army on the battlefield. When they say Israel has a right to defend itself, again, that's a crazy idea, when painting themselves as the victims when they are the aggressors. But the idea is, does defending yourself mean killing unarmed men, women, children, and elderly people, shooting babies in the heart, shooting babies in the head? Is that what you call defending yourself? Because if that's what it is, Israel has no right to defend itself. Everyone knows this, but no one wants to say it because you're not allowed to say things about these people. Because they are the chosen people, they're allowed to do whatever they want, and they're going to continue to put that in your face. That's the whole party line of repeating Israel has a right to defend itself. This is total nonsense. Do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Yes, in fact, it's guaranteed under international law. You have a right to resist by armed struggle your occupiers. Remember that Israel does not accept that they are occupiers. They think that they are the indigenous people of the land, so there is no such thing as occupation. You really have to make sure you're clear on your interlocutor when you're talking about an occupation. Ask them if they accept the notion of occupation. If they don't, then you can't really continue the conversation. The next two myths they're titled the Oslo mythologies and the Gaza mythologies. So it isn't, let's say, one specific myth. And here again is another gap in my knowledge. I've only read around what happened in Oslo, and I understand broadly why it failed, and I've come to see it, why it failed. I've been in all areas A, B, and C in the West Bank, and I know what is going on has been a failure with my own eyes, but I've started to understand that Oslo was meant as a way to manage the situation rather than come to a solution. And Pappe says this much more eloquently than that. So in truth, without the application of extreme pressure, there is no reason in the world why a native population would ever volunteer to partition its homeland with a settler population. And therefore we should acknowledge that the Oslo process was not a fair and equal pursuit of peace, but a compromise agreed to by a defeated, colonized people. As a result, the Palestinians were forced to seek solutions that went against their interest and endangered their very existence. And keep in mind, after Oslo, there was a period in which the the factions within Palestine that disagree on political solutions, there was a coming together of some of those parties to try to see whether this was going to work. But very quickly they saw that this policy of making the Palestinian Authority the subcontractor for security for Israel and reporting back to Israel, effectively collaborating with Israel, this caused enormous internal problems. The Oslo peace process did not fail simply due to its adherence to the principle of partition. In the original accord, there was an Israeli promise that the three issues that trouble the Palestinians most, the fate of Jerusalem, the refugees, and the Jewish colonies, would be negotiated when the interim period of 5 years came to a successful end. And I would point out to you, if you're having discussions with people who are open-minded and willing to talk, these three issues need to be understood and discussed. What is going to happen with Jerusalem? What is going to happen with the refugee right of return, which is underwritten by a UN resolution? And what is going to happen with the settlements, which are understood as illegal by the majority of the world? The majority of the world considers, even U.S. technical policy, is that the settlements are illegal. So there's a difference between the paper policy of the U.S. and its actions. But on paper, the U.S. still considers those settlements to be illegal. Ever since the first peace conference on post-1948 Palestine, the Lausanne meeting of April 1949, the refugee problem has been excluded from the peace agenda and disassociated from the concept of the Palestine conflict. Israel participated in that conference only because it was a precondition for its acceptance as a full member of the UN, who also demanded that Israel sign a protocol called the May Protocol, committing itself to the terms of Resolution 194, which you should read that if you haven't read that resolution, which included an unconditional call for the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes or to be given compensation. A day after it was signed, in May 1949, Israel was admitted to the UN and immediately retracted its commitment to the protocol. Going back to an earlier myth, are those the actions of a democracy? Are those the actions of an honorable person? That you'd sign something, and then the very next day after you got what you wanted, you unsigned it. This is not someone to be dealt with seriously. This is not, again, if that was a person, that wouldn't be someone you could deal with seriously. And as a country, Israel can't be dealt with seriously. It needs to be isolated and made the pariah state that it is. So this is alluding to the January 2000 Camp David meetings, which brought Arafat there under a lot of pressure. By this point, Arafat had seen that Oslo was a joke, a failure, and he knew that Clinton was going to blame him if things didn't work out, and big surprise, Clinton did. Clinton has said this, that it was Arafat's fault. Hillary Clinton, that bastion of truth-telling, she herself has repeated this lie, but the reality is that Israel did not come to negotiate in good faith? If so, we would have a copy of the document in which a Palestine state was promised. This is once again another myth that is repeated. That's one of the myths here of Oslo and of Camp David, that they were given a proposal for a state and Arafat rejected it. If that is true, please show us the receipts. What are you going to claim that there's some sort of national security risk if you were to produce that paper? The national security risk would be to Israel, because if the Israelis found out that the Palestinians were promised their own state, there would be riots in the streets, because Israel has not agreed on the idea that Palestine is going to have their own state. And so if you are saying that the Palestinians were promised their own state, please just show us the written proposal, and then we can accept that you're right. But until such time, we know that you're lying. If you don't have proof for an assertion that doesn't compromise, spies or agents in the field somewhere, you're just lying. It's like saying that, a building that wasn't hit by a plane can just collapse into its own footprint. After the owner of the building said that he asked for it to be demolished, he told the fire department to pull it. If you want to believe such things, go ahead and believe such things. All right, myth number 9, the Gaza mythologies. The new Israeli methods of oppression introduced during the Second Intifada, particularly the building of the wall, the roadblocks, and the targeted assassinations, further diminished the support for the Palestinian Authority and increased the popularity and prestige of Hamas. It would be fair to conclude, then, that successive Israeli governments did all they could to leave the Palestinians with no option but to trust and vote for the one group prepared to resist an occupation described by the renowned American author Michael Chabon as the most grievous injustice I've ever seen in my life. And remember, a majority of Christians in Palestine voted for Hamas as well, because Hamas indicated that they were going to resist. They were going to resist Oslo, and they were going to resist the thuggery of the Israelis. And so the idea that Christians voted for Hamas because Hamas was going to impose a Sharia ethnic Arab state, they're out of touch with reality. You have to look at the numbers. Why did Christians vote for Hamas as a majority? Because they knew that Hamas was here, the only government, the one group prepared to resist an occupation. So that's why. No less important, Hamas's position on the 1948 refugees' right of return, unlike the PA's stance, was clear and ambiguous. Hamas openly endorsed this right, while the PA sent out ambiguous messages, including a speech by Abu Mazen. If you don't know, Abu Mazen is another name for Mahmoud Abbas. Remember that this is one of the ways that Arabs refer to each other. This would be the father of Mazen, in which he rescinded his own right to return to his hometown of Safad. So I don't think that's ambiguous. If you have the head of the Palestinian Authority saying that he has renounced his own right to return, then how could other Palestinians take comfort in the idea that someone's going to fight for their right to return? So, Abbas, that's a different conversation, but the man is a disgrace in many ways, but I don't want to get bogged down in that. This is talking about a couple killings of Hamas leaders that happened in 2004, it looks like. These killings took place before Hamas won the 2006 elections and took over the Gaza Strip. In other words, the Israeli policy did not undermine Hamas. On the contrary, it enhanced its popularity and power. Sharon wanted the Palestinian Authority to take control of Gaza and treat it like Area A in the West Bank, but this outcome did not materialize. So Sharon had to deal with Gaza in one of two ways: either clear out the settlers so that he could retaliate against Hamas without the risk of hurting Israeli citizens, or depart altogether from the region in order to refocus his efforts on annexing the West Bank or parts of it. In order to ensure that the second alternative was understood internationally, Sharon orchestrated a charade that everybody fell for. As he began to make noises about evicting the settlers from the Strip, Gush Emunim compared the action to the Holocaust and staged a real show for the television when they were physically evicted from their homes. It seemed as if there were a civil war in Israel between those who supported the settlers and those on the left, including formidable foes of Sharon in the past, who supported his plan for a peace initiative. And of course, if you don't know who Ariel Sharon is, he's a war criminal, as most IDF generals, soldiers, veterans are, but most notorious for his role in the Sabra and Shatila massacres, as well as kicking off the first Intifada, the second Intifada, by his visit to the Temple Mount, as Ben Gvir has recently mimicked. Finally, the two-state solution is the only way forward. If I have room, I think I only can put 5 cards per video, but if I have room, I will put a card to Norman Finkelstein's book, Gaza, an Inquest into Its Martyrdom, because that will help you understand more about the Gaza mythologies. And if I still have room, I'll add a card for Jeff Halper's book about one democratic state, because the last myth is the two-state solution is the only way forward. And obviously, it's the one that has the most international recognition. But the problem is the Israelis have never accepted the two-state solution. So if the Israelis don't accept it, it doesn't matter if the entire world accepts it. It cannot move forward. The two-state solution is dead. The Israelis were never interested in the two-state solution. They only said that they were interested to move through various stages, to do whatever they needed to do. As we saw at the 1949 Lausanne Conference, they lied about the right of return in order to get UN membership, and as soon as they got that, they rescinded their statement. So the Israelis are not interested in a two-state solution, so talking about a two-state solution is ridiculous. If you want to get serious, start looking at the possibilities of one democratic state and its relationship, understanding that in relationship to how South Africa moved on from apartheid. I'm not saying that South Africa is a model state. I think most South Africans would tell you their country is still a bit of a basket case. But there's no question about apartheid being considered okay, which is what is happening in Israel at the time. Apartheid is considered okay, and most of the world doesn't really know that apartheid is what goes on in Israel. So, as I say, this is a great starter book. If you're new to this issue, if you're new to my channel, you'll have seen I have reviewed a lot of other books, but periodically I will say, oh, I should have read this book earlier, and then I say, but then I wouldn't have known other things. As always, when you read a book like this, you get a guide to what you need to study. And as I said, the two biggest holes in the myths that I discussed were 1967, which I'll have a review on in the next few weeks about, and Oslo, which is something I continue to study. It's not as much a priority for me. I think I might do a review on that process next year. But for now, I would recommend this as a book to help you understand the arguments if you're going to have a discussion with someone who's actually reasonable and willing to hear the other side. If you'd like to support this channel, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing this content with someone who you think could benefit. If you'd like to buy this book, you can use a link in the description below. That's one way you can support this channel. Another way you could is if you became a Patreon member, supported the work, you'll get early access to videos like this one. You can also do that by becoming a YouTube member, whichever you prefer. It's the same, you get the same privileges. You can also talk with me about the process, about the books that I select, and talk with others in our small growing community. If you'd also like to look at books for 2025, you can look at my Amazon wish list. If you'd like to buy a book from there and send it my way, I can't promise that I'll review it right away, but it's getting closer to 2025 and looking at how the books will be set up for next year. A reminder that a portion of the proceeds from all these different means are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. If you don't know about this organization, it's a fantastic organization. You can see their work on social media. They help deliver medical care to children in Gaza who could not otherwise receive it. Until next time, enjoy your reading.